Recently, I viewed a good video by a YouTuber, Adam Walker. He has a popular booktube channel. He's an ex-academic. I think he taught maybe as an adjunct at Harvard University, kind of like an Ivy League preppy guy. And the video is called The Decline of the English Department, a topic near and dear to my heart. At last check, that video had 32,000 views. So it is getting traction, as they say. Adam tells a story of how the study of English literature has evolved, and some may say devolved in de-evolutionary fashion from its peak in the 1950s and 60s. And Adam cites 7 change factors, and I'm going to summarize these super fast. He talks about these in his video, but also in a Substack article that he wrote, which I'll link to in the show description. First factor, English departments abandon the traditional curriculum for an unstructured smorgasbord style. Second factor, public universities gravitated towards STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math, at the expense of the humanities, because that's where the moolah was. Number 3, tuition skyrocketed, making it harder to justify a humanities degree such as English. Number 4, literary and cultural theory that preferred ideological to aesthetic and formalist reading became the new orthodoxy. And it did not help that the most practitioners of theory wrote poor, inscrutable nonsense. Number 5, the American university model shifted from teaching to research. Being a good researcher gets you tenure, which means you have to become a specialist and carve out a niche. So the noble aim of general education, like learning what it means to be human, that gets reduced to lip service. It looks good in the college catalog, but doesn't really amount to much anymore. And being a good teacher, instead of being a good researcher, gets you a pat on the back and a pauper's wage, which feeds us into factor number 6, over-specialization, which is a function of this research model mentioned just before. The introductory level teaching duties in English departments were offloaded or delegated to underpaid adjuncts and non-tenure track faculty, such as myself, who worked in the shadows and the dusty corners of academia. You have had a whole class of academic gypsies who are barely scraping by, often working at 2, 3, 4 different colleges, running around. These are literally warm bodies who are signed on to fill a classroom, and they all too often get less than 0 respect. Speaking generally here, this isn't always about my own personal experience, but this is pretty common. Factor 7, the English department lost their public voice, or lost public voices, public intellectuals. These voices were either marginalized by mainstream media, or the people just retreated back into the ivory tower. They stopped engaging with public discourse, pretty much. So that's his 7 factors, and they're all good. It's a good list of factors. I agree with him on all of that. I would only add one or two other factors to that mix. One is the bifurcation of English departments into competing factions. I especially noticed this personally when I went to graduate school at University of Texas, Austin. But it had been brewing for some time, and it's only gotten worse since then. This was in the late 80s when I was in grad school. But these factions are, you have the traditional literature faction, but then the new kid in town was the rhetoric and composition faction. And then there was also the creative writing faction. And none of these factions really got along so well. And this is all a byproduct of that smorgasbord and specialization phenomena I mentioned before. We might also add the dire situation we find ourselves in today. It seems like nobody reads anymore. Books do not have the cultural sway that they once had. Newspapers don't run book reviews at all, or if they do, they don't give it much space like they used to. No one seems to care about the publishing world. And I'll add one more factor to this mix. English departments, with some exceptions, obviously, largely abandoned the study of contemporary literature, or maybe they never did, and they should have studied contemporary literature. And by contemporary, I don't mean like brand new literature necessarily, but I mean stuff that's maybe been published in the last 50 to 75 years. This has been a pet peeve of mine my whole career, is they made very little attempt, the English departments broadly speaking, didn't make the attempt to kind of fuel the canon, like to update the canon in such a way as, like, you've got these traditional works that you're going to read, you know, Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Jane Austen, Victorian novelists like Dickens, and classics of world literature and all that we should be reading, all that stuff. And you get to the early 20th century and you have your big wigs like Faulkner and Hemingway and Joyce and Virginia Woolf and whatnot. But then you get to around mid-century, 20th century, and you just go off the cliff. There's nothing. There's just air. You know, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion of books that have been from recent history. So then that kind of creates this sense that the English curricula is dead. You know, like we're just studying corpses instead of this living, breathing thing called literature, which has been going on all along. People haven't stopped writing, and people are still publishing really good books. But we kind of aborted that conversation. And it's true that some newer books did get discussed in creative writing courses and in topics courses, themed courses, you know, upper division, things like that. But the hard work of maintaining the cultural canon was more or less abandoned, and we dismantled the canon and did not try to build a new one. I'm speaking broadly here, but hopefully you take my point. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. Now it seems much more like a free-for-all, and that comes back to the smorgasbord, choose your own path type of education that we find ourselves in today. And as a result, like, then the tradition sort of withers, and people forget, like people in my classes who had never heard of Adam and Eve, for example. Okay, so I do like how Adam's video talk and his Substack story don't leave it there. Like, this isn't the end of the story. This isn't even the total purpose of what he's writing about. It's so easy to clutch our pearls and bemoan the death of literature and reading and how everyone's turning into a distracted moron. But something else may be afoot. something that's emerging in the desert lands, something shooting up like new flowers. And Adam calls this a major cultural reorientation. He sees a revival of reading the classics and new online teaching initiatives and discussion groups that are happening beyond the borders of academia. General readers, let's call them armchair readers, and autodidacts are finding their tribe on platforms like YouTube, like on channels like this, maybe. And as Walker says, quote, "The public commitment to literature is increasingly countercultural. Readers are turning to the canon out of a desire for meaning and beauty," end quote, because they're not finding that meaning and beauty in mainstream culture and mainstream discourse. So there's a craving, there's a hunger, there's a thirst there that these books provide and these kinds of discussions provide. And this stuff is not being taught to them necessarily in academia. So they're going elsewhere to find it. He also says, quote, "The custodianship of literary culture has passed from institutions to the public reader, those seeking wisdom, meaning, beauty, and intellectual depth in an age of distraction," end quote. Ironically, in the midst of this reading desert, he sees a renaissance of reading. I guess I see some of myself in this picture, which is why I wanted to comment on it and amplify what he's saying. That's why I'm doing this response video. So let me first share Adam's closing remarks from his Substack piece, because I like where he lands here. Quote, "What will the future look like? Will the new stewards of literature go underground in an oppressive technocratic bureaucracy like the last remnant of readers in Jules Verne's Paris in the 20th century? Or, like the Petrarchs and Poggio Bracciolonis of the Renaissance, will they bring to light forgotten literature and usher in a new movement of humanism?" Say what you want about the decline of reading, but something is happening now. While the flames of literacy are dying, the buried coals are heating. And that's how he finishes the Substack story. So yeah, I thought that was a really good read and a really good watch. These are great questions. And I do agree with Adam. Something is happening. I'm not so sure it's coming as big or as quickly as he's seeing it, but I do believe we are participating in a broad cultural resistance movement of sorts. People are trying, with varying degrees of success, to unplug, tune out, and tune into something deeper, richer, more meaningful. Reading, like I've said before, can be an act of resistance. I often think of it that way. It's a rejection of what other people want me to pay attention to and a reclaiming of what I want to pay attention to on my own terms. And I think a lot of other people are doing that too. Maybe we are headed in the direction foretold in the Louis Malle film, My Dinner with Andre, one of my all-time favorite films. So I'm going to quote this passage. This is Andre speaking. "See, I think it's quite possible that the 1960s represented the last burst of the human being before he was extinguished, and that this is the beginning of the rest of the future now. And that from now on, there'll simply be all these robots walking around, feeling nothing, thinking nothing. And there'll be nobody left almost to remind them that there once was a species called a human being. with feelings and thoughts, and that history and memory are right now being erased, and soon nobody will really remember that life existed on the planet. Now, of course, Bjornstrand feels that there's really almost no hope and that we're probably going back to a very savage, lawless, terrifying period. Findhorn people see it a little differently. They're feeling that there'll be these pockets of light springing up in different parts of the world, and that these will be, in a way, invisible planets on this planet, and that as we or the world grow colder, we can take invisible space journeys to these different planets, refuel for what it is we need to do on the planet itself, and come back. And it's their feeling that there have to be centers now where people can come and reconstruct a new future for the world. And when I was talking to Gustav Bjornstrand, he was saying that actually these centers are growing up everywhere now, and that what they're trying to do, which is what Findhorn was trying to do, and in a way what I was trying to do, I mean, these things can't be given names, but in a way, these are all attempts at creating a new kind of school or a new kind of monastery. And Bjornstrand talks about the concept of reserves, islands of safety where history can be remembered and the human being can continue to function in order to maintain the species through a dark age. In other words, we're talking about an underground, which did exist in a different way during the Dark Ages among the mystical orders of the church. And the purpose of this underground is to find out how to preserve the light, life, the culture, how to keep things living. You see, I keep thinking that what we need is a new language, a language of the heart, a language as in the Polish forest where language wasn't needed, some kind of language between people. That is a new kind of poetry. That's the poetry of the dancing bee that tells us where the honey is. And I think that in order to create that language, you're going to have to learn how you can go through a looking glass into another kind of perception, where you have that sense of being united to all things. And suddenly you understand everything. Since I first saw My Dinner with Andre in the early 80s, I've never forgotten that dialogue. I believe we are at this point when the old order is collapsing around us. I'm not so sure that a renaissance is just around the corner, though. We might have to go into the wilderness for a while and seek refuge. And in Andre's vision from the film, people would be seeking out intentional communities like Findhorn in Scotland and many others. And some of that might occur and still is occurring. What's different, I think, in the 21st century is that the online space that we spend so much of our time in these days affords you the ability to tunnel into virtual communities. It's a different kind of underground, but the effect is similar. These are not formal institutions by and large. They are ad hoc, bespoke, organic. It's important that we value these spaces and be protective of them, because the hustle monsters are always knocking at the gates, aren't they? Anyway, I don't know where all this is leading. I'm just a lowly writer who loves to read. But I do appreciate Adam Walker's optimism. We need more hope. Yes, I'm afraid academia is indeed crashing and burning. There will be blood and gnashing of teeth, figuratively speaking. People will lose their jobs and livelihoods, and that is no laughing matter. But the current institutions are, let's face it, rotting, unsustainable. This can't go on like this anymore. So let's think creatively, differently, and see the demise as an opportunity to make something new. And that's what I think Adam Walker is getting at. What are your thoughts? I'd love to know. Leave a comment or ask a question. This doesn't just apply to English departments either. You could lump in the whole humanities if you wanted to in this conversation, because I think they are all touched by this issue. Thank you, as always, for listening to me ramble. I hope it got you thinking, and I will leave links to Adam Walker's content in the show description and encourage you to check it out for yourself. So peace out. I hope to see you soon. Happy reading. Bye-bye.